Okay, you're listening to the award-winning Philadelphia Hall Monitor here on WPPM 106.5 in Philadelphia, on Comcast Channel 66, and streaming live at phillycam.org. You can find us on Twitter at Hall Monitor WPPM, on our website www.hallmonitor.org, and on Facebook at PHMWPPM. Tonight on the program, big night. Council President Darrell Clarke will be joining us. Tomorrow is his last stated meeting of City Council. It is truly the end of an era, and we will get to speak to him about that. And Denise, you and I did that interview yesterday, actually. So how are you today?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing fine, thank you. And Lance, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
Now, Lance, I want to start with you on this because you actually worked with Council President Darrell Clarke. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I want to say I worked with him before I was in government. I worked with him when I was working for the mayor, and then I worked directly for him when I left Mayor Nutter over a disagreement about the sale of the gas works and what was happening in municipal court with old liens. So I think I know the council president professionally well, not personally well. And I would start out with an appreciation. I mean, I think he has done an unbelievably great job for the people of Philadelphia, quietly, without telling people how wonderful he is, without picking fights. Certainly there are things I thought he could have been more aggressive with. But if I were to make a list of the things that he actually did, it's truly amazing. He managed to lower car insurance prices for every driver in Philadelphia by fighting with the insurance commission, by fighting with the insurance companies, and he actually ended up winning that fight. He changed the way water rates were set in the city. In the bad old days, the water commissioner would ask for a rate increase and then decide whether he had made a good decision in asking for the rate increase. Council president changed that. Again, I'm critical of some of the things that happened, but an appreciation for somebody who actually looked at this and thought about poor and working people and changed it. He refused to allow the sale of the gas works. Now, if you're a suburbanite and you have a municipal water department that was just sold and you saw your rates go up by 50, 75, 100%, you recognize how much savings the council president created for every Philadelphian. In addition, by refusing to allow it to be privatized, he kept the good paying union jobs. He kept the jobs in the city. He kept making sure that minority companies got contracts, and he kept the low income plan in place. He really made the real estate taxes in the city more progressive. And that's really a challenge because I think, as our listeners know, Pennsylvania has a uniformity clause. So in theory, everyone has to pay the exact same rate. So the council president came up with the homestead exemption, which gives which at that time gave a $45,000 discount to everyone. So the more your house was worth, the less the discount was. And then when Mayor Nutter's actual value initiative started forcing the property values to skyrocket and the assessment to skyrocket, the council president almost doubled that and allowed people to stay in their homes. Fewer people were chased out. He set up neighborhood preservation, funding it with an increase in the real estate transfer tax, which is, again, a tax that basically new buyers are paying. So he's capturing the new value and he's putting that in. He helped lower the 10-year tax abatement to 5 years. He had requirements to bring more supermarkets into the city. And one of the things I don't think that people recognize is what he did for the budget. So the city of Philadelphia's budget now has a higher credit rating. And again, I would be very critical of how much power the bond rating agencies have over the city and over the people. But the reality is that they control what the city pays to borrow. And the council president shepherd of the bills through council, the budget bills, allowed all the services to stay in place and sometimes actually to increase spending while at the same time increasing the city's bond rating. So the borrowing costs went down. And I don't think many people who look like me appreciate all that the council president has done during his career. I mean, from the big things like making sure one-size zoning wasn't in every neighborhood, to saving gas consumers literally millions of dollars, to the little things like making sure that there was going to be non-police police on the streets to try and solve parking or parking in bus lanes so that the SEPTA ride doesn't take so long. So from the really big issues to the really little issues, he's played an incredibly important role. And I do, I hope that the new council president, and I'm pretty sure we all agree it's going to be Kenyatta Johnson, I hope he grows into the same type of council president that Council President Clark grew into. And I don't think that there's been enough appreciation. Some of that may be because Council President Clark appears to me to be somewhat press shy and has not gone out and done a lot of interviews with the mainstream media. Thankfully gave us an interview. But I think as a result of that, few people know anything about him and few people understand exactly how smart he is. I mean, he may not have graduated from Wharton, where a lot of corporate criminals graduated. And he may not have an Ivy League degree, but I think most people, if they actually spoke to him for more than 5 minutes about the city budget, they would be hard pressed to find anyone who's as well educated about it, who knows as much about it, and is actually able to figure out what we can do about it. Again, from the little things like what do we do with the sinking fund, which is what pays off the city's debt, to the major issues about millage rate. And I didn't even talk about schools. I don't know if our interview he spoke about schools, but he orchestrated the change in the real estate tax ratio that made sure the school district got more money. And he made sure that the city donated money directly to the school district from time to time. Now, again, we can be critical. The school district still doesn't have enough money. And there's a real problem there. But the problem is with the state. The council president figured out how to rejigger things without city layoffs, without cutting services, to get more money from the real estate taxes to go into the schools. So for all those reasons, I think that we have been very fortunate to have him as a council president through what I would consider the lackluster years of two mayors. We had two mayors through 4 terms who were unable to provide the leadership for the city that the council president did.
Yeah. And so what I want to do now, I want to play that interview, and then I want to talk a little bit about the interview itself and then legacy too at the end. But let's play that interview first. So here is our interview with Council President Darrell Clark. Council President Darrell Clark, thank you so much for joining us. And it's kind of a special treat to get to talk to you. I have a lot of things, so I kind of narrowed it down a little bit. But the first thing I wanted to talk to you about is what made you decide, okay, I'm going to run for office initially?
I was drafted. I was perfectly comfortable working for the then Council President Street, doing a good job, having significant responsibilities dealing with the 5th Councilmatic District. But somebody talked John Street into running for mayor, and he thought it was a good idea. I didn't necessarily think it was a good idea because I was quite comfortable working for the council president. But he made that ultimate decision, and then people started thinking about who was going to, in fact, represent the 5th Councilmatic District. There was some obvious concern given his tenure as the councilman and subsequently the president that brought a lot of resources to the district. And people kind of started pointing fingers, and I ended up being at the end of the fingers. So I didn't have much of a choice, and I ended up running. Was one of the closest elections in history as it relates to council. I think there was approximately 23,000 votes cast. I won the primary by a meager 144 votes. Was challenged in court. Ended up maybe some 8 months later, the federal courts, which is where it ended up, ruled in my favor as it relates to that particular court challenge. And here we are now.
Wow. So same question, how do you then become president of Philadelphia City Council?
Well, I was in a position where I had some pretty good mentors, and I had some good mentors in council. as a council person, Ann Berna, Janie Blackwell, had Marion Tasco, and I actually ended up being in a position to run for majority whip, which I did. It was this big fight over who was going to be the council president. And quietly, I went out and solicited support to get the votes for the majority whip. It was always thought that if you wanted to have a meaningful opportunity to have a positive impact on policy and legislation in the city of Philadelphia in the legislative branch, you had to quote unquote be in the room. And if you were a member of the leadership team, you were in the room. So I went out and got the necessary support, and I became the majority whip.
And then that leads to city council president. Is it the same kind of situation?
Yeah. Well, both council president Berna and majority leader Tasco made a decision that they were going to retire. So that the natural inclination was for me to attempt to move up. But somewhere along the line, there was some change of heart with one of the council members, Councilwoman Tasco, that she decided that she may want to stay on. So it was quite a interesting back and forth between who would ultimately win. I was fortunate enough, and I got to give kudos to him. Then Councilman Wilson Good ended up being my 9th vote that gave me the majority support for council president. Then fast forward 12 years, here we are at this point in time in my career. So it was a choice that was made by me and by members of council, and a choice that I feel proud of. An incredible privilege that I had been given, not only being a council person, but being in leadership in council. And I consider myself blessed to have had this opportunity.
So as city council president, you must have so many people reaching out to you every day, so many different ideas coming across your desk. How do you prioritize things, and how do you, because you're basically doing 2 jobs at once, district council member and city council president.
Right.
How do you manage all of that?
Basically devoting your entire life, in this particular instance, to the job. As you said, it's a broad-based level of responsibility. Understanding the district that I represented, the most diverse district in the state, from Rittenhouse Square to north of Temple University, literally up to Hunting Park. So you have all types of diversity, economic, racial, socially, and to be able to manage that required a significant level of primarily the staff's time, but my time too as a council person. Being a council president, you are immersed in every aspect of, be it legislation or be it citywide policy. So you must obviously devote a significant amount of time to that particular responsibility. But at the end of the day, I think I was fortunate in that I played a role as majority whip that kind of prepared me to a large degree to leadership. But it's nothing like being a council president, not even the mayor's job, because the mayor is essentially the executive. And when the executive says, this is the direction that we're going to go, that tends to be the end of the conversation. But in the legislative branch, you have to get a consensus on everything we do. We have to get a minimum of 9 votes to pass any legislation. In the event that the mayor does not concur, you must have 12 votes if he determines that he's going to veto that. And if there is going to be any charter changes, we have to get 12 votes, which we've been in a position to do on a number of occasions. So it's a full-time and a half job, but again, I was blessed to have that opportunity.
When it comes to legislation, policy, really anything, how do you make a decision on which way to go? What do you look for? Is it the same every time? Does it change? But how do you make that final decision?
Well, on a personal note, I have to feel comfortable with the position that I take. The first thing you do is have all the facts before you. You also need to, depending on what the legislation or the policy is, make sure that the stakeholders get a seat at the table. And then ultimately, you have to make a decision in a very transparent way. Unlike people in the executive branch, where you make decisions on policy, you don't do it in a public way. You basically, depending on what government office you work in, you make that policy decision and then it gets implemented. In council, not only do we have to have a public hearing, we are also required to have public comment. So people have multiple steps as it relates to a bite at the apple to make their position known on whatever it is we do in council. And we literally sit in the same room with all the stakeholders, i.e. the citizens of the city of Philadelphia, in addition to which we are carried live on radio and live in person in the council chambers and live on channel 64, the government channel. So our position and our role is done in the most transparent way imaginable.
All right, I'd like to bring in Denise Clay Murray here on Philadelphia Hall Monitor.
Well, thank you so much, Larry. And thank you, Council President, for giving us a few moments of your time. We really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
As you said, you've been doing this for 12 years as Council President. What made you decide that this was the year that you were going to not only walk away from the presidency, but also walk away from council?
Well, I actually had given it some thought last term, briefly mulled with the decision to call it quits at that particular time, but I needed to put myself in a position where I made a decision based on not necessarily my gut, but the needs of the city. There were a lot of things that we had in play. I'm appreciative of the fact that I made that decision because COVID hit. That was a very challenging time for us all, and it required institutional knowledge. It required significant leadership. We had a good team, and I can't emphasize enough the importance of having a good team in council. As I said, council is about building consensus from people that have different constituencies, different perspectives. So I'm glad I made the decision to stay for that year. And as a result of the team staying together, so to speak, we were able to get through some very challenging times with the social unrest, however you would like to characterize it, in getting through the most significant pandemic that we've had in decades in the city of Philadelphia. So it was the right choice. But at this particular time, I felt it was time for me to do something different with my life. I felt comfortable and confident that the people that would succeed us, there were a number of other members left to run for mayor. I thought that people were adequately prepared. Are they prepared for the particular job? Pretty much, but whoever will be the new council president, that will be Councilman Kenyatta Johnson. He's never been council president before, so there will be some nuances associated with that role, a more expanded role. The Majority Leader Parker will become the mayor. Is clearly something that she never did before, and it will require a whole lot more responsibility in interaction with the general public. But I feel confident that both of them will be able to carry the charge. Councilwoman Parker will staff up in a way that I think that will be in a position to move forward on the positive things that have happened over the last 4 years. Clearly, Councilmember Johnson will be in a position, having interacted with all of us for quite some time, had a lot of confidence in his ability to move forward as a council president. So I'm optimistic. Again, I tell people I'm a phone call away, and believe me, if the phone doesn't ring, I'm okay with that because that tells me that things are going okay.
Okay, now You talked about the number of council members that resigned from council to run for mayor. One of the prevailing rumors was that you were going to be among them. Had you ever considered running for mayor? And if so, what stopped you?
Yeah, I gave it serious consideration at the end of Michael Nutter's term. Pretty much had it teed up to have most of the support. Pretty much all of the unions were on board, had a significant level of politicals, quote unquote, on board. I think had I made that run, I believe I would have been successful. But at the end of the day, the fire didn't burn in my belly. And if you want to be the mayor, you want to run for mayor, I think you should be all in. And it just never got to a point where I felt that I was all in emotionally. The other part of the equation is that as council president, I really enjoyed the heck out of this job. As you can see, if you look at the things that we've been in a position to do, moving forward on significant policy issues, bringing to bear resources, unprecedented, $400 million in neighborhood preservation initiative that followed the $100 million that's not talked about as much about housing preservation, being able to do charter changes to create more efficiency in government, having a more inclusive process as it relates to council, but more importantly, the residents, having zoning board changes that required that residents from the general community be a part of that process. It just goes on, the things that we've been in a position to do, creating unprecedented levels of support for individuals who are out in the neighborhoods dealing with an anti-violence initiative. So being in a position to shepherd and work with colleagues to bring all that to bear has been pretty much a very, very, very interesting and enlightening opportunity for us.
Now, you said that you have possibly the most diverse district in the state. And when you look at the 5th Councilmanic District, you're like, okay, there's a whole lot of stuff that you could say one of these things is not like the other. The part of your district that I dealt with most was Temple University. I was a student there, and I covered North Philadelphia when I first started out in my career. In terms of that part of the district, it all has kind of begun and ended with the stadium that Temple University wanted for their football team, which I'm going to be nice enough not to comment on here. But in terms of that, has that gone away? And was that the toughest decision that you had to make as council president, or what was the toughest decision you had to make?
Well, one, albeit Temple University having a significant footprint on North Broad, it's actually a relatively small part of my council district. It's just prominent in that it's a large university and it is on Broad Street. But the footprint is minimal, given the fact that we go all the way up to Hunting Park and all the way to Rittenhouse Square, over to the river on one side and the river on the other side being at the Delaware. That was not a very difficult decision for me. It never made sense to me in terms of an operational perspective. Temple could never put in place a plan that talked about the challenges that would be presented by closing off a major thoroughfare, which was required, i.e. 15th Street, the impact on the local community, this whole issue around parking, not trying to be critical, but the fact that they didn't have a first-class team, and that shouldn't necessarily be a requirement. It just never made sense. And I consistently told the representatives from the university, if they can get the necessary support from the local community, the most impacted group of people, it warranted some sort of process that allowed the conversation to get to a serious level. We had numerous conversations, community meetings. They could not muster, to my knowledge, a single entity or a single community represented that talked about, in a positive way that it made some sense to build that. So ultimately, I represent the constituents, the people that live there, first primary. Understand that I have to make decisions that impact the entire city, but that one just didn't make any sense. The current site where Temple was proposing to build, we actually just passed legislation to build a new communications facility on that site. So that's pretty much the end of that conversation. Wasn't, as I said earlier, wasn't remotely close to the most difficult decision I had to make.
Well, what was the most difficult decision you had to make?
There were multiple decisions I had to make that did impact citywide. I mean, you talk about votes, like one of the challenging votes we had to take was the sugar tax, as an example, which was very challenging in terms of these resources, a positive thing, pre-K, recreation centers, libraries, clearly things that people would like to see more resources go to. But when you talk about the sugar/soda tax, one might say, well, that shouldn't be that difficult. That product might not be good. But then you looked at the impact on who actually would pay the bulk of the tax. It was clearly focused in minority communities. And essentially, we're looking at putting a tax burden on a part of a community, singled out based on every analysis that we did, that we didn't think it was fair. Therefore, we had to expand that to other types of drinks, beverages, and that was ultimately done. But we also wanted to make sure that if this revenue is generated, it should be used in the most impacted areas as it relates to the revenue source. So once we got to the point, we ultimately took the vote. It was very controversial, but it was for a good cause. But there's just been, having been here for a long time, there's so many challenging votes that we had to take. But at the end of the day, you get elected to make a decision. There's no such thing as, from my mind, as punting and not taking the vote on a difficult issue. You made a decision to run for a very difficult position as a council person.
Okay, I guess my last question for you is about my personal favorite part of city council, public comment.
Mm-hmm.
You get up there every week and you deal with the kinds of characters that would be best on a sitcom at times. And you have to manage to keep everyone within the length of time that you have allotted for people to speak on certain issues. When you do public comment, do you often find yourself asking, okay, I know I have to allow this, but how am I going to keep a straight face with some of this stuff? Because you never laugh at some of the more hilarious stuff that we in the press box often laugh at. You always keep a straight face. How do you do that?
Well, my nickname is the City Hall Sphinx. So, and I heard that you guys call me that. But over the years, you've heard pretty much everything, and you must remain a certain level of decorum, not only in the council but on the podium. You were right. We do have some quite interesting testimony and public comment, but at the end of the day, the General Assembly required that the city of the first class has to have public comment. Public comment came from smaller municipalities and townships that did not have public hearings for the legislative process. We got lumped into the state's requirement. So in a township outside of in the suburbs somewhere, they will require public comment. They didn't have a public hearing. I get it. But as you know, having been here for a while, that we have extremely lengthy public hearings at some point in time, sometimes over multiple days. But for whatever reason, the General Assembly required that we get lumped into that. So we established guidelines to allow public comment, and we have been doing that ever since, and giving people the opportunity to speak on the matters that they care about most. And we do it in a way, in spite of some of the more interesting levels of testimony in a professional manner. From our
Mhm.
side, we try to.
Well, thank you so much for giving us some of your time today, Council President. We really appreciate it. And I'm going to give you back to Larry McGlynn, and you're listening to Hall Monitor on WPPM 106.5.
All right. Thank you, Denise. And Council President Clark, thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome.
All right. Well, we would like to thank Council President Clark for being with us here on the program today. And it was really interesting to speak to him and hear about some of his experiences and how he runs things. Denise, you know, what has it been like for you to cover this council president?
Well, what I think probably the thing that has stood out to me about Darrell Clark is it showed up kind of in the mayor's race. Because when you look at some of the decisions that had to be made, particularly on the budget when it came to anti-violence funding and COVID and different things, and you saw these unified decisions coming out of Philadelphia City Council, these 17-0 decisions. And then you saw the mayor's race after all of these people resigned and started running for mayor against each other. You're like, wow, Darrell Clark really knew how to keep the arguments that were going on inside council chambers from getting out of council chambers. Because particularly when you heard like Sherelle Parker and Helen Gim and Derek Green in particular, you know, go after each other when they were having these candidate forums, and then David O would come in and he'd go after everybody. I'm like, you folks didn't particularly like each other for real. And Darrell Clark was able to keep us from finding that out until you all wanted to run for mayor. And you know, it was really interesting to see, and you kind of wondered, you know, how much, you know, how many times did he have to bang the gavel on these folks at certain times?
And I think some of that, the way he handled things, came from his personal experience. You know, he had been in council as a staffer starting, I think, 1980, and you know, worked his way up from staffer to council member to council president. But in those years as a staffer, those are some tumultuous years on city council. There were literal fistfights happening. There were people arguing all the time. Even when he was a council member, there were still arguments. When you go back through some of the old newspaper clippings about those years in council, you see a lot of that. And I suspect that part of the way he managed council was because he thought we shouldn't be doing these things on the floor. We shouldn't be having these arguments. It just doesn't make us look good. It doesn't make the city look good. So being able to take care of some of that behind closed doors, I think, was one of the hallmarks of his leadership.
And it was an important hallmark because at the, you know, particularly the last 8 years, there's been a lot going on. You had the COVID pandemic, you had the rise in gun violence, you had folks finally paying attention to a Kensington that has been a mess since I was in college in the 90s and has just gotten worse. You know, you had all of that going on. And if you didn't have somebody who was able to build consensus in the way that Darrell Clark was able to do it with the personalities that he was working with, you know, that could have been a total disaster, which is why, you know, I kind of look at the presumptive nominee for city council president, Kenyatta Johnson, and I wonder how he's going to manage the council that he's about to be handed. Because the council that Darrell Clark presided over for 12 years and the group of people that's going to make up city council, you know, for the next 4 years at least, are two entirely different groups of people. And they include one Republican, two Working Families Party members who are to the left of the even of some of the progressives that are on council. It's going to be really interesting to see, you know, if, you know, council member Johnson is going to get the same kind of, or, you know, be able to handle some of the personalities that in the way that Darrell Clark did, because the personalities he's about to be handed are really strong personalities. So it's going to be interesting to see how he manages that.
Well, one of the things that always struck me is that the council president Clark you kind of saw on the podium was also the one you would get when we spoke to him after council. Always kind of the same. Lance, in your experience, you had worked with him. Was that what you saw? The behind the scenes, Darrell Clark was kind of the same.
So he didn't let on how hard he worked.
Mm.
It was incredible that the amount of energy he put into it, that he always dedicated at least a day to go back into his district to meet for people. He was often there before 8 o'clock in the morning. He was often there after 8 o'clock at night. He had an open door policy, which is incredibly unusual. He had almost no pretensions. So you could go and see him and he would talk with people. He didn't say, you have to talk to my staffer. You didn't have to make an appointment. You didn't have to do this. He was open to the conversations. And there's a few other things I'd like to point out, at least as far as I know. Now, I worked directly with his office for 2 years, and I voluntarily left, not because I was unhappy with the council president, but because I was unhappy with the direction of the country. And I thought there were more important things I could do with my time than work for the city of Philadelphia. That being said, the council president, there, at least as far as I know, there has never been anyone who has made any allegations about him accepting bribes, about him being inappropriate in a city where, unfortunately, it's not all that unusual to find people in power who have been accused of all types of inappropriate behavior, sometimes convicted, sometimes found innocent. But that is the norm. Council President Clark, there's absolutely nothing that's ever been said about him about that, as far as I know. Second, he didn't accept a second job. One of the things I tried to persuade him to do, and I was not able to, was to teach. We all talk about how he's able to build consensus, but that's a real skill set. I often thought that the council president would have been a better labor negotiator for a labor union than a council president, because his ability to figure out what everyone's vantage point was and what the leverage points was is really incredible. And that's a tremendous skill set. Most of us think only about our point of view, and we think the person who has a different point of view is wrong and that we're right. Council president was able to listen to somebody else's point of view, try and accommodate it as best he could, try and build a consensus around that. And I thought it would be great if he would agree to teach a class once a week at Penn or at Temple or at LaSalle or at Jefferson. I have a longtime friend who's got a doctorate in political science who I lined up to co-teach with him. Council president said no, he didn't want to take a second job. He didn't want anyone to think of him as taking any money from anywhere else. He wanted to be dedicated to working for the city. Now, I think we all know that one councilman was convicted of a crime because he worked for a labor union. Another councilman works for law firms. Another councilman owned multi-million-dollar businesses. The former mayor, or I should say the current mayor, that's a slip of the tongue, but I guess that's partly on him. Mayor Kenny spent most of the years that he was working in city council as a consultant for a developer. Council President Clark refused to do any of those things because of his dedication. So I think that's really an incredible thing. And I think that's part of what made him so successful. Nobody could say, hey, when you're saying this, we're looking behind what you're saying and seeing a bribe or seeing this or seeing that. Now, he did like to build low-income housing. I don't know that that's a bad thing. If you were in his office, his council office, not his council president office, he had many shovels from development projects for low-income housing, specifically in his district up on his wall, because that was where his heart was. His heart was making sure his constituents had decent places to live. I also want to talk a little bit about what we've all kind of made fun of, which is the public hearings. I do recognize that some of us who show up at public hearings are tangential at best, to be kind. But it is really a remarkable thing to have an elected representative say, yeah, I know some of the people who are showing up are creative in their thinking, but the thought and the process and the principle of having an open government that not only has open hearings, every bill before city council has a public hearing where anybody can go and show up and testify, but also has a public comment period. I just want to, for a second, contrast that with the state of Pennsylvania. State of Pennsylvania, hearings on bills are private. If you show up with a sign, they remove you. I have been arrested in the gallery of the state house for holding up a sign that said, fund LAHEAP. Pennsylvania is one of the few cold weather states that doesn't fund LAHEAP. Not only was I arrested, I was pulled over the chairs because it was such an outrage that I would hold up a sign. In council, under Council President Clark and previous council presidents, people get to be heard. And that is, I want to appreciate that, because those of us who believe in a participatory democracy, who say voting isn't enough, you have to participate if you want to be heard, welcome a council president who, I'm sure it's hard for him to stand there and listen to people attack him. I'm sure it's hard for him to listen to people who show up every week and basically say the same thing. And I'm sure it's hard for him when someone starts testifying about a bill that has to do with SEPTA and ends up talking about Amtrak. I'm sure those are all real challenges because it's his time and he's there, but he does it. He did it. And I'm hoping that the next council president will have the same dedication to public participation that Council President Clark did. And yeah, I get it. I know, I've been there. I know that some of us, for whatever reason, just can't control ourselves. And we want to talk about the zoo when the bill has something to do with taxes, or we want to talk about taxes when the bill has something to do about SEPTA. But that's the nature of us. If you want people to be included in democracy, you have to create a vehicle. I know we're running a little short on time, but I would like to tell one story because I think this really encompasses everything. Let me give the background. The city of Philadelphia has an energy authority because of Council President Clark's bill. That energy authority has done such amazing things as making it possible to have solar cells on roofs, to have green roofs. It was what made it possible to try and harness the power of the rivers for electrical generation called in-stream generation. It also was able to make sure the city got the lowest price of electricity it could and to swap out the electric lights so that they're more energy efficient. Again, from the really little things like maybe we shouldn't be using high voltage lights, maybe we should be switching to these new technologies, to the really amazing things like how do we position ourselves for the future? Part of the reason why the city of Philadelphia is going to be part of the hydrogen hub. And I recognize not everyone thinks that's a great thing, but the promise of that at least is there in part because Council President refused to sell the gasworks and set up the Energy Authority. And here's a story I want to tell about that. At the time, I was not working for the Council President, but I was advocating that the city ought to take a position as the price caps came off the electric company through deregulation. So when the electric company was deregulated, there were 10 years of price caps. In the 11th year, no one knew what the price was going to be. So I was advocating the city ought to be in a position to buy energy for everybody and do the best it can. The council president heard me at a public hearing, took a slightly different direction. Again, I'm not saying I always agree with him, took a slightly different direction and said, well, we're going to do this to protect the city. He wrote a bill, he introduced the bill, and he had a meeting with a deputy mayor who I'm not going to name because she recently passed. And I don't want to be in a position of telling an embarrassing story to someone who can't be here to say that's not accurate. But I was in the room with Tumar Alexander, who's the managing director of the city. I was there, the council president was there, and I believe John Christmas was there, but I can't be sure of that. So I'm sitting in the meeting and the council president is looking at me and saying, do you want to say anything? And I was like, I'll wait. This deputy mayor walks into the room and looks at the council president and says, I'm going to tell you why your bill is illegal and wrong. And then she proceeds for close to 10 minutes to tell him how he didn't know what he was doing, how he was completely wrong, and the bill couldn't be legal. Now, the council president didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He didn't say, hey, I'm smart. I've got smart people around me. I've got good staff. He just listened. He just listened. And Tumar and I were, I should say, Mr. Alexander, we were kind of now at this point looking at our feet because we knew that this was what the deputy mayor was saying was completely wrong. But neither one of us wanted to be the one to like say, hey, what are you talking about? We were kind of waiting, thinking the council president, that should be what he says. So he waited, and for 10 minutes he was berated. He was somewhat ridiculed, and I believe insulted. After the 10 minutes were up, the deputy mayor said, so you're going to withdraw the bill. And all he said was, have you read the bill? And she said, not exactly. He said, well, almost everything you're saying isn't accurate. It's not in the bill. I would suggest you read the bill and then come back and talk to us, because I think we have very different things we're discussing here. She, of course, with a lot of bravado, got up and left, blamed her staff. Kumar and I, again, couldn't look up because you don't want a deputy mayor to be, you don't want to embarrass a deputy mayor that badly. So we're trying to hide. So she, we're not part of this embarrassment. But the council president never defended himself, never said how smart he was, never did anything. He took advantage of this deputy mayor misjudgment. He was able to turn that around. And as a result, he got the Energy Authority passed. He got to staff it with the people he wanted, and he got to use it in the way that he wanted to use it. And we are all better off because of that. The solar cells, again, it doesn't solve everything. 1,000 solar cells on rooftops isn't the solution to a huge energy problem that we face now and will face in the future. But it is those type of thinking and that type of process that allows us to continue to struggle forward and try new ways. And for a council president who, for the most part, is seen as very quiet, as he said, the Sphinx, who doesn't champion himself a lot, who doesn't talk a lot about all that he's done, to be able to do all these things quietly, in some ways behind closed doors, is really incredible. And, I personally don't think that we have given him enough credit. Part of that is he didn't ask for credit. In the interview, he didn't talk about all the things he's done. He didn't talk about balancing the budget. He didn't talk about the credit rating going up. He didn't talk about paying off the PICA board and the PICA bonds, and that's all done. He didn't talk about the Energy Authority. He didn't tell any war stories. I'm telling more war stories than he told, and I knew him tangentially, and I worked with him, but I have more war stories I'm willing to tell about what he has done than he has. For example, at one point, and this goes back a number of years, there were super fresh markets, supermarkets, and the company that bought them had filed for bankruptcy and was closing them. Acme wanted to buy those markets so there wouldn't be food deserts in the city, and also because Acme wanted to make money. I mean, that's what they're in business for. They're not a charity. They're in business to make money. So they put in a bid to buy up all the super fresh markets. At this point, I was working for the council president, the council president's office. I brought to him a picture of where these supermarkets were going to close and showed him that this was going to have a bad impact on neighborhoods. He looked at it and he said, okay, what can we do? I said, well, we have to organize the communities around these markets to contact the federal government to stop them from trying to apply the antitrust law to these markets, because a supermarket in a neighborhood that has the only other choice is a 7-Eleven or worse is not a realistic choice. And this theory that the federal government was putting forward that we shouldn't have these supermarket really would hurt us. Council president said, all right. I brought to him a new way of organizing using an email list. He looked at it. He said, fine. And we were successful. Now, if I were the council president, I think I would want to tell those stories. He did it, not me. I mean, I'm just staff. This is all through his direction and his ability to figure out where the pressure points were, who he could work with, and what he could do. But, you interviewed him for almost a half an hour. I don't think he claimed anything.
Mm-mm. No. So Denise, let me ask you, when Darrell Clark will be the former council president emeritus, January
Mhm.
2nd. What is his legacy?
Well, as I said earlier, I think his legacy was the ability to build consensus. Um, he can also count among the pieces of his legacy, you know, getting anti-violence funding in the hands of people who are working directly with in the neighborhoods where the violence is going on, because we've always had funding go into, anti-violence programs, but the peace budget, which caused council to have to spend a whole lot of late nights during the 2021 fiscal year budget season. Um, that money was going directly to community groups that were working with people who were victims of violence or who were trying to stop people from becoming victims or perpetrators of violence. And it also went toward, dealing with the trauma that comes with being a victim of violence. And it went into things like programs for young people who are experiencing PTSD and things like that. I think that the peace budget is a part of his legacy. I think that his ability to maintain consensus is a part of his legacy. And to the people at in the Temple University area, the fact that he basically killed the Temple Stadium is going to be a part of his legacy. Because let's face it, that had been an issue for a long time. And my hope is whatever the council president does next, because from what I understand, he's going to be not necessarily on council, but doing some governmental related things. I hope that he gets the chance to build on what he did in city council. But I do not envy, income. I do not envy the incoming leadership of city council, not just because they have big shoes to fill, but also because they're going to be trying to fill those shoes with people who are completely and totally different than the people that Darrell Clarke had to work with. And I think that he expressed a lot of confidence in Sherelle Parker and in Kenyatta Johnson, working together as mayor and city council president. But I don't think with the particular group of people that are coming into city council that the city council president is necessarily going to have the same kind of power when it comes to getting legislation in and out that Darrell Clarke did. Because really, when you sit down and you talk to some of the newer people who were elected to council, they're not going to lie down. They're going to fight. And they're going to fight for things that the mayor's definitely not going to want to do, and that the council president may not want to do. So it's going to be interesting to see how that gets negotiated, especially when you consider the fact that those weren't really fights that Darrell Clarke had to go through.
Yeah. And it's absolutely big shoes to fill and a learning curve for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
So I think part of the legacy is the charter changes, the advocacy groups that are represented because the council president put the bill: disability, gay, lesbian, transgender, insurance, and most recently, protection for the community groups. He has a charter change that would allow registered community organizations to be indemnified against SLAPP suits. So I think that the inclusion of different groups in city in a way of making that work, I think is the legacy. I think finding creative ways to make our real estate taxes more progressive, and also doing that for businesses. So we like the idea of small businesses. So the city has found a way. Council president has figured out how to do this through the budget of saying the first $100,000 of income that a small business makes is untaxed. So including community groups in zoning and making sure that we don't have one type of zoning for every district. One size never fits all, and it certainly doesn't fit all when it comes to zoning. Where I live in South Philly, we like it dense. You know, that's really what we want. We want that density, but I don't think that's true for every neighborhood. Lots of neighborhoods want lawns and want backyards. If you ask my neighbors, what we want is more housing and more coffee shops and more places to eat. And we wouldn't mind a store we could actually buy something at, but we we can't drink coffee at every shop can't be a coffee shop, and every restaurant, every store can't be a restaurant, and every store can't be a bar. So every now and then it'd be nice to have something where, you know, if I need to buy something, I can. But I think that's a part of the legacy. Certainly the Energy Authority laying the groundwork, and I don't think we're going to see that until we see whether the hydrogen energy hub is going to be worthwhile or not. And I don't think I'll be around to see that, to be honest. But I think 20 years from now or 30 years from now, that may prove to be one of the most important things that the council president did. If the promise of hydrogen power is there and it's real, and we can generate the hydrogen cleanly from the rivers using the PGW infrastructure, council president put that all together with the Energy Authority. That may be one of the great legacies. And it's, again, not something he gets credit for focusing on the environment, but he did that. And finally, all of the programs that help people stay in their homes. You know, we are very fortunate in the city of Philadelphia that many more people want to move in. That's good news. The bad news is that chases up property values, and it makes very hard for longtime residents who fought to make the city great, who got rid of the drug dealers, who cleaned up the short dumping. I'm told in my neighborhood, the alleyway behind where I live used to be where working girls worked. Neighborhood group, that's one of the neighborhood groups' claims of what they did to improve the neighborhood was evict the working girls. You know, but those are people who put their lives on the line to improve the neighborhood, to make it safe, to make it a place where people want to move in, where developers want to build. And the council president's defense of those people is really very powerful. And that, again, remains a legacy. I do agree with Denise. I'm hoping that the new council president is going to be able to figure out how to do it, because in the same way that Council President Clark couldn't do it like Council President Street did it. I mean, again, let's be honest. John Street was a genius. It'd be very hard for anyone to do it the way that he did it. But Council President Clark found a way to do it. And I think we have to hope that Council President Johnson, or presumptive Council President Johnson, finds a way of being grounded and finds his own style of doing it. Can't expect him to do it like the council president, but I think we have to hope for the good of the city that he does find a way to do it.
All right. Well, thank you both so much. We'd like to thank Council President Darrell Clark for joining us on the program. Next week, Councilmember Anthony Phillips will be with us. And Lance, we're going to talk about chicken prices next week.
All right. Why you're paying too much, and why Pennsylvania refuses to do anything like Washington State.
Yep. And very important. So thank you all for being with us, and we'll see you next week on Hall Monitor.